if you're council asking a consultant to submit a model, or if you're a consultant submitting a model, these are the kind of things I'd be looking for. Firstly, is a short design report that just gives the rationale for the music model. What's the catchment? What's the development that you're dealing with? What are the main treatments? What are the key parameters and assumptions you've used? What's the climate data? Just summarize all that for council, so that for the council planner that it doesn't have access to music, has never used music before, they can read through that report and say, I'm generally comfortable with what's proposed here. All the numbers and assumptions are clear and laid out. Any justifications that are needed are here. And there's a clear table or statement showing that the results are meeting the best practice objectives. Would always expect that with a model. There's nothing worse than trying to assess a model where you've not been given any report or any context whatsoever.
Dale, where you've got their model itself, electronic copy, that's your .mrt file?
That would be the .sqz file. That's the actual model, the SQZ. And then I've got here the summary report, which is the MRT file. So ideally submit both of those, and then council's got everything they might need to check it. The reason I recommend submitting the SQZs is because if council has got an engineer that does want to open up the model and look at it, then they can do that, and then they can click around the nodes and look at things. And sometimes that helps just to look at how things are laid out. Is it making sense? It gives them confidence. Also, as an assessor, sometimes I'll look at something and say, oh, that's a bit questionable. So I'll open up the model, change it to what I think it should be, rerun it. And if it makes 2/5 of nothing difference, then I won't even bother wasting time flagging it. The other thing is it's useful to have it for reference, so that if down the track a consultant wants to consolidate all of your WSID assets and model them, especially if it's a council project or something, then you've actually got the models on file so that they can be used for future projects. Probably less critical for a private development to have that. Do a screenshot. There's nothing worse than reading a report and trying to assess it and you can't see what's going where. So just grab a screenshot of the model, and then that, if you're dealing with the many councils that don't have music, at least they can see how things are laid out and satisfy themselves that it all makes sense. Summary report, as I said, that's what you need to run the auditor, and then provide that explanation and justification of any variations from the guidelines or any auditor parameters that get flagged. People get excited when they see the auditor and they think it's going to do everything for them, and I wish it could, but the reality is that we can only check the inputs in the model, and there's a few things that we really need an intelligent person looking at the report and looking at the model and saying, does the catchment and the drainage layout actually make sense? So things going where we expect them to. Do they match the design plans? And I must admit, I got sent something today. We did a design for someone, they sent back design plans for it, and I looked at it and I said, this looks nothing like our model. A few phone calls later and we realized that the civil engineers doing the detailed design hadn't actually read our report, and they haven't actually seen our music model. So they've got no idea what we're expecting to see put on site, and what they're designing does not even vaguely represent what we've modelled in our music model. So seems stupid, but you do need to check it. Checking the whole catchments there. I would call out the impervious fractions. The impervious fraction in music is a really important parameter that has a huge impact on the flows and the pollutant loads. It makes a big difference to the outcomes. So you need to have a look at what assumptions have been made and ask yourself, is that representative of the likely future conditions? You might have measured roof and pavement areas, or you might just have a land use that's residential and they're just assuming it's about 70%. So you need to check whether that's reasonable for the context. Is that suitable for the townhouse development you're looking at? Is it representative not only of what will be built, but what realistically is going to happen in the future? Sometimes developers come in and they say, this gravel area immediately outside the back of the house is all pervious, but it's gravel, it's going to have a table or something sitting on it. You can see that the first thing that homeowner is going to do is build a deck or pave that area. So you need to have some allowance in your impervious fractions for some increase over time and some attrition. And let's be really honest about what's going to happen with these areas.
That's a good point you raised, Dale, because I'm seeing lots of infill designs sent to me for comment for townhouse developments of 4 or 5 up to about 20.
Yep.
And they really have a very modest backyard.
Yep.
And it is showing also as greenscaping in their landscape contribution. Yep. And I do think we just have to be really pragmatic about what's going to happen.
And you've got to make a realistic assessment of what that impervious fraction is, what's being built and what's likely to be there. I'd take the view too that Permeable and pervious is vegetated permeable spaces, and anything that's not a vegetated permeable space, I'd generally be treating as an impervious space. So where people are sort of gaming the system with a deck or a semi-permeable space, the reality is if you've got a large deck, you end up having to drain the area under it and collect that. Otherwise, you'll just get water accumulating and it can't really get away. There's pseudo-permeable surfaces like lily-dale toppings or gravel paths where they compact the soil under it and then lay down gravel. Yes, it will absorb a bit more water than a concrete footpath, but it's not going to operate anything like a grass lawn or a garden bed or something in terms of actually absorbing the water and returning that back to the atmosphere through evapotranspiration. That's really what we mean when we say permeable. A couple other things to check are just those areas and asset dimensions. Sometimes it's worth doing the calc to say what's the treatment area, what's the catchment area, and what's the ratio as a percentage of catchment, and does that make sense to me? As I said, if it's a really, really low percentage, I'd be concerned. And equally, if it's a really large one, you may go back and just double check what they're actually intending and designing there. And the other ones are, at present, we don't assess things like GPTs or link routing, partly because they're so specialised and there's so many different possible things that can go into them. It's difficult for us to meaningfully check them, but if you've got them in your model, you obviously absolutely need to be checking those. If there is demand for checking of proprietary products, please tell us, because that is something that could be added in, but we haven't had anyone asking us for it to date. It's certainly something that's on our radar that we probably should be building in future.
At the moment, probably the best guidance that I've seen available is the City of Blacktown's guidelines. Yep. They're a very experienced council in working with proprietary products, and they've offered up what they accept as pollution reduction targets for certain products. Yep. And while the SA practitioners weren't ready to nominate that in our guideline because they didn't have that level of experience collectively, Blacktown have.